My name is Thomas Webb, and I'm here at the Pritzker Military Library. Today is February 12th, 2014. I'm here with William Falk, and we're going to talk a little bit about his military experience, his experience in the service. So how are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing fine, Tom. Thank you.
Oh, good. Just to start off, let's talk a little bit about growing up. When and where were you born?
Actually, I was born September 29th, 1949 in Elmhurst Hospital.
Okay, so local.
Local.
And what was it like growing up in Elmhurst?
Well, I actually didn't grow up in Elmhurst. We were living in Franklin Park at the time.
Okay.
And I lived there until I was in, maybe 5 or 6 years old, and then we moved to northern Wisconsin for a few years, then to Minneapolis till I was in 4th grade, and then we moved back to the Chicago area, and I mostly grew up in Wheaton.
Okay. Why did you move? Was it your dad was working?
Well,
or?
My dad's a carpenter.
Okay.
He's actually still alive. He's 92 now.
Wow.
And he had his own small carpentry firm in Franklin Park, but then he and my mom decided they wanted to try to run a resort in northern Wisconsin, where Dad had grown up.
Well,
So they tried that for a few years and then didn't make that much money doing it, and it was a lot of work, so he decided to go back to carpentry in Minneapolis.
Okay.
And then moved here because the winters were better.
It's hard to imagine on a month like this, but yeah. Let's talk a little bit about high school then. So you went to high school down in Wheaton?
Right, I went to Wheaton Central High School, which has since closed.
Yeah. So about the time that you were set to graduate high school, Vietnam
was going on. I graduated in 1967.
Okay.
So the Vietnam War was quite active at that point and much in the news.
Yeah. And what were some of your thoughts and feelings as you sort of approached graduation of high school, knowing that perhaps some of your friends were being drafted?
At that point, I'm not aware of any of my friends having been drafted because virtually all of us were going on to college and were expecting student deferments.
Okay.
I was actually 17 when I graduated from high school, so hadn't yet had to sign up for the selective service.
And then where did you go to college then?
Went to Michigan State University.
Okay. And why did you pick Michigan State?
Well, I was attracted by a couple of things. First, they invited me there for a scholarship competition, which I didn't get, but it introduced me to the school. And they had an honors college that would allow me to create a major that fit what I thought I was going to be doing as a career.
Which was?
Which was to become an actuary.
Okay. And so that was something you were interested in even as you're transitioning into college?
Right. We had a career night at school where an actuary had come in and spoken about the career and the opportunities for someone who was mathematically oriented. And it seemed to fit, although I wasn't 100% committed, so didn't want to go to a school to a purely actuarial program like the University of Michigan. But Michigan State allowed me to create an experience there that gave me all the basics I needed and allowed me to also have the flexibility should I decide not to become an actuary.
And did you ever waver, or once you got into the program you were...
I started passing the exams and just kept with it.
Yeah. So we've talked a little bit about the fact that the Vietnam War was already in full bore, I guess the phrasing would be, by the time you're in college. We know from history a little bit that colleges and universities, student life and military life didn't necessarily mix. What was it like on Michigan State's campus?
Not quite as activist as a lot of other campuses. It's a fairly conservative, or was at the time a fairly conservative place. I did spend a couple of months in the ROTC program before dropping out of that, deciding I didn't have enough time for it.
Oh.
I had a roommate who was in ROTC my freshman year, so I got to watch him shine his boots all the time. And I was on the debate team, and the woman I was going to end up marrying a couple of years later was also on the debate team with me. And we had a lot of discussions among debate team members about the Vietnam War and what was going on in the country at the time.
Yeah. What did ROTC involve?
3 days a week of class and shining boots, marching.
Marching, running. So you went all 4 years of school. You got your...
Actually, I graduated in 3 years.
Oh, wow.
Plus 1 summer.
Yeah, and then you started working.
And I started working at CNA Insurance in Chicago.
Okay.
The spring of my second year there, Lydia and I got married, and late that year, we had our son born. So at the time I graduated, I had a family.
And was there any apprehension then as you approached graduation at Michigan that the draft is still going on? It's a possibility?
Quite definitely. The lottery had happened, and I was in the first year of the lottery, and my number was 161. And I pretty much knew there was a high probability my draft board would get to that number and beyond after my student deferment ended.
Yeah. And what was the mood like then at home? I mean, you have a growing family, relatives in the Chicagoland area. Were they fearful for you, or?
Oh, I'd have to say yes. I mean, my mother was from England.
Oh.
And was actually in the British Women's Army during World War II.
Wow.
And absolutely hated anything to do with war. And, instilled that attitude in us that war was not something that was desirable at all, if it could possibly be avoided. I did actually start the process of trying to enlist in the Illinois National Guard, but started it maybe a month too late and got the draft notice before the process was far enough along to forestall getting drafted.
Did anybody else in your family serve in the military, or?
My father was in late World War II. He was actually a carpenter.
Okay.
And went in after the troops had cleared an area and followed them all the way to, I think, Nuremberg, Germany, where he was part of a crew that rebuilt the hospitals there.
Oh.
And my father-in-law was an officer in the Army and was a weather forecaster / air controller in North Africa.
I'm not familiar with an air controller.
Air traffic controller.
Oh, air traffic controller. Well. So you've talked a little bit about your mother's feelings about. Did your father and father-in-law have different feelings, or were they sort of?
I think they were basically in agreement with my mother. I think they all understood why World War II happened and why they had to serve in that to eliminate the threat, but none of them were supporters of the Vietnam War.
Okay, we're to the point of you being drafted.
Yes.
How does that work?
Well, it started out when I had to go down to get a physical in the fall before I went in the military, and being processed by doctors on an assembly line and basically told, yeah, you're well enough to go in. And so you get categorized a 1A, and then it's up to your draft board. Received the draft notice, I think it was in December, for an induction date of January. And so it was not a happy Christmas, but because we knew what was going to happen afterwards. And there was concern. I mean, not everybody who got drafted would end up in Vietnam, but there was some concern that I might.
And at that point, did any of the people that you graduated high school with, that you had maybe gone to college with, were they also starting to get drafted, or?
I know there were some in the military, but we didn't. I didn't have any really close friends in high school that I talked to about it at that point. I knew that some of my wife's friends from high school had been drafted and were serving in the military. But since I graduated a year earlier than my class in college, none of my classmates were subject to it yet.
Did you ever consider not graduating early for that?
I guess the thought crossed my mind, but really no.
No? Yeah. And then they mail that to you. You
Yes.
just get it in the mail.
Just get it in the mail to report to the Chicago Induction Center on a certain date at a certain time.
Now, I don't know a lot, you know, we have a lot of discussion these days about military families, but as someone that was drafted, what kinds of steps did the military take to, I know that your family joined you later on, but did they make any kinds of, we will help your family, or?
Well, basically what they did is when you go through all the paperwork, which I think happened when I was down at basic training, getting processed into basic training, you would say, oh, do you have a family? Yes. What are the details? And then as a result of that, your spouse received, I don't remember what they called it at the time, but received some money. You received your pay, and then there was a family allowance that went to her. And so and then she became eligible for what at the time was called CHAMPUS, the Civilian Health and Medical Program for the Uniformed Services. Today it's called TRICARE. And basically then she was eligible for free medical benefits from the military.
And was your wife working at this time, or was she?
She was actually working to finish up her degree. She was getting a math degree in math teaching. And still had a little more work to do. So she had to do student teaching and then get a couple more courses.
And was that in Michigan?
Yeah,
Okay.
basically.
When the draft notice comes, does it say specifically what branch of the military you've been drafted into? Do you have an option to sort of pick at that point?
You have no option.
No options at that
And
point?
my recollection is it did say that I was being inducted into the Army.
And what was the feeling, I guess, when you said it wasn't a very great Christmas,
Well,
but
you know, it's sort of, okay, I got to go through it and I hope everything works out. It's going to take, at that time, you think 2 years of your life that you have no control over, and you'll have to tough it out.
yeah. And you said 71 for that?
Yeah, I was inducted in January of 1971.
Okay. And was there any sense at that point that, you know, this war has been going on for a long time, it's starting to wind down, or was it still, the public didn't really know?
Yeah, I don't recall a sense that it was necessarily winding down. I think there was probably a sense that it can't go on too much longer, but nobody really knew what that meant at that point. It was still very active, and there were still an awful lot of people on the ground in Vietnam.
Yeah.
Now, before I was drafted, I actually worked for about 6 months, 7 months at CNA in Chicago. And while I was there, there were 2 or 3 actuaries who came back from military duty. They had finished their 2-year commitments, and so they were back, and so I had an opportunity to talk to them. One of them had ended up in Vietnam, and the other one had not. So I knew a little bit more of what I might expect based on what they told me.
And did that make you any less apprehensive, or?
Yes and no. It made me more apprehensive in knowing more about what was going on in Vietnam from the one who had been there, but less apprehensive from the perspective of the other one, because he provided me with some information on things I might end up doing in the military that wouldn't cause me to go there. And it actually ended up being what he said and not the one who went to Vietnam that I ended up doing in the military. He was also an actuary and a mathematician, math major, and he ended up spending his military service in Fort Huachuca doing math,
Yeah.
which he thought was great.
Yeah. Pay me to do what I want to do anyway.
Right. Although not pay you very much.
The gentleman then that had the similar skill set, and you might not be able to answer this, but he had a similar skill set but still went to Vietnam. Was he actually involved in fighting, or was he doing some kind of statistical analysis?
He wasn't doing math, but he wasn't in a combat unit.
Okay.
He was in a support unit.
And do you feel like the military tries to take people with, these kinds of skill sets, or is it just kind of the luck of the draw?
It's a little of both, I think, from my experience at basic training. They sometimes try to fit you in spots where they can maximize their use of your skills, but to a large extent it's timing and luck as to whether they actually are able to do that.
Well, let's talk a little bit about boot camp. How did you get there, first of all?
Well, we went to the induction center, which was downtown Chicago, near downtown, just west of the Loop in Chicago, and got sworn in. And then we grabbed all our stuff, were put on buses, and bussed out to O'Hare to a waiting chartered jet that flew us down to, I think it landed in Shreveport, Louisiana, and then onto another bus to go to Fort Polk.
And could I just ask, so I get a sense, when you're in the induction center here in Chicago, how many are we talking about being with you in that?
There were probably 100 or so.
Okay.
I mean, we filled the charter jet, so.
Well, that's quite a few then.
Yeah.
And what was the mood like on that flight?
Quiet.
Quiet. Yeah. All kinds of people, I'm sure, on that flight
Yeah,
as well.
yeah, from all different backgrounds, from the Midwest, not necessarily all from the Chicago area, but close enough that was their nearest induction center.
Okay.
So they flew us down there and bussed us to the base, and then we got there late enough in the day that we just were assigned a temporary barracks and went to bed. And then the next morning they started the processing, which includes all the stuff you read and hear about.
Mm-hmm.
The haircut,
Mm-hmm.
changing in all your civilian clothes for some uniforms that don't necessarily fit perfectly.
Mm-hmm.
Things like that.
How did your uniform fit?
Mine wasn't too bad.
Okay.
They're always baggy. They're not tailored or anything.
Right.
But I didn't have any strange sizes, so they were pretty much able to get me one that fit fairly well. Except for my dress uniform cap was somehow odd. I never figured it out.
Well, my grandfather talks about getting boots that were way too big for him, and
Yeah.
he didn't understand until he started running for that training.
Well, mine were basically the right size, although they were the right size only because they had an insole insert to put in them.
Mm. And so, what is your reaction? I have, a Hollywood sense of what this is probably like, but maybe that hadn't been made clear beforehand.
No, I mean, I guess I'd never seen that many movies about getting inducted in the Army before I did, but it's from the movies you do see, it's a lot like it. You're in a long line, you go through, everybody gets a haircut, you get a choice of a number 1, a number 2, or a number 3.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're smart, you take the one that has the shortest hair, because it gives you the fewest problems. They go through, at least when I was inducted, they went through at least either 1 or 2 days, and it was fairly extensive battery of tests. Intelligence tests, language tests, all sorts of tests. And you get a visit you have to go to the post-optometrist if you wear glasses, because they prescribe and give you special glasses that the military supports that are less breakable and things like that. So all this stuff they have to go through. all the while being yelled at by the drill sergeants. And then at the end of that, you get lined up and they send you off to your training platoons. And so then you go to another barracks, and that's where you spend the next 8 weeks.
During this time, do you start looking at the people around you and saying, okay, that person seems like a good person to buddy up with, to stick with, or do you just sort of keep to yourself?
At that point in basic training, we each sort of kept to ourselves. I mean, you get to the training platoon, and one of the first things that the drill sergeant does is he picks out someone to be the squad leaders. Usually someone who's big and athletic looking and fairly intelligent, although not necessarily the smartest ones in there, because they make fun of the smartest ones always. And then you start figuring out what the routine is, and they tell you what you're going to be doing, when you're going to get up every morning, when you're going to eat. And each day you have a schedule of the classes you have to go to as a group, physical training sessions you have to go through, if you're going to be practicing marching and drilling, rifle range practice. You know, every day there was a different schedule of all these activities you had to go through. What to do if you felt sick. Get the sick call first thing in the morning. All the different jobs you were going to be assigned at some point during your 8 weeks there. Everybody's going to have to work KP. Because these were in Fort Polk, very old barracks, the barracks were built in World War II, totally out of wood. And they showed you the first day, the scare movie, where they actually showed you how quickly one of those barracks burned down. And in 2 minutes, it's burned to the ground. So every night, there has to be someone awake on each floor of the barracks watching for fires. So, okay, given how many men there, about once or twice a week, you got woken up for 2 hours in the middle of the night, or you had to just stand there and watch. Everybody has to pull guard duty one night. Everybody, you know, as I said, KP, charge of quarters, CQ duty. There'll be one night when you get awakened in the middle of the night and you have to go to the orderly room for the company and just sit there in case someone phones up. So there are all these things that get you into the military way of doing things. And all surrounded with a lot of physical activity and trying to strengthen people up.
Were there any of those duties that you thought, well, this isn't so bad? Of all of them, I don't mind this one.
CQ is not bad. You're just sitting in the orderly room. You know, you can read or you can talk to the other person there while you're waiting for the 2 hours to see if anyone calls. Guard duty was sort of the most ridiculous one we had, where the only thing there was to guard on the base was the nurses' barracks. So you had to stand in front of the nurses' barracks, and whenever one of the nurses came, you had to challenge them and say, who goes there? Show me your ID. Okay, we'll let you in. So you got a little practice doing guard duty.
During this time, were you allowed to make phone calls back home?
You could make phone calls when you had free time, which was usually on, you know, Sundays were free. They had some rules that they weren't allowed to do any formal training on Sundays, and even minimal training on Saturdays. You had to have some time off. And after the first 4 weeks, it was possible to get a base pass for one day where you could leave your company area and go to the post movie or something like that. And after 6 weeks, if you really were nice to your drill sergeant, he could give you an off base pass for 2 days. So there are a few little things like that you could do. And they encouraged writing letters home and things like that.
Well, let's talk a little bit about your drill sergeant and the pre-interview paperwork. You do give a little bit of a anecdote about SFC Little Feather.
Sergeant First Class, Little Feather. This little, I mean, he couldn't have been more than about 5'2" or 5'3", maybe even 5'1". American Indian descent, tough as all get out, and he made you know it. And I mean, he was fair. He didn't do anything that I would consider to be out of line, forcing people to do stuff that was inappropriate. But if you screwed up, he was all over you. And he honestly believed, and I think he was doing his best to try to make us civilians into the best soldiers we could be. He wasn't there to abuse us or because he was power hungry. He just thought he was good at turning people into pretty good soldiers, at least at that basic training level.
And was he your primary drill sergeant then?
Well, he was the drill sergeant in charge of our platoon.
Okay.
Each platoon had a drill sergeant, and then there was the senior drill sergeant, I forget what title they gave him for the entire company, and then the company officers. We didn't really have platoon lieutenants like you would once you got out into a regular unit.
And what are some of the things that Little Feather would do to try to make you into these wonderful soldiers?
Well, the platoon I was in wasn't really great at drills, marching. We had some people who literally couldn't tell their left from their right, and while I don't have a great sense of rhythm, they were even worse. And so he never could order us to practice on Sundays, but he talked to our squad leaders and sort of suggested that, you know, if we really wanted to do well when we came up to the review and when, you know, the company commander and others checked on our progress, we really might want to consider doing a little practicing on our own, which we then did, and we actually got to the point where as a unit we were acceptable.
Okay.
As with, I think, all drill sergeants, he was really into the therapy benefits of push-ups. To the point where there was one day when our platoon wasn't doing something properly, and we got so many push-ups to do that the next morning I literally could not lift up my arm to brush my teeth. My arm was just totally dead.
And did they make you do more work that day, or did that?
Oh, we kept working. Fortunately, no more push-ups, but plenty of other things. I think that day we had to go on a long march.
Oh, well.
Which was a little
saves
better.
your arms a little bit.
Yeah.
Being drafted into, you know, a conflict that a lot of people had very strong responses to. Was there anybody at Basic that acted out or really resisted being there?
There really wasn't anybody in the training company I was in who was a discipline problem.
Okay.
I mean, just the normal, you don't do what the drill sergeant says fast enough, you get the immediate push-ups, or you have to go clean out the grease trap or something. That we didn't have anyone who was a problem that required administrative punishment or court-martial or anything like that. So I guess we were a well-behaved group in that respect.
And how was morale then?
I think it was as good as I would have expected. I mean, nobody was acting depressed. I mean, nobody was happy about being in the Army other than the few who were volunteers, but most of us were draftees.
Okay. There was a few that...
There were some, yeah. And you could tell because those of us who were drafted, if you looked at any of our orders, we were identified as being AUS, Army of the United States. Those who volunteered were RA, regular Army.
Okay.
So the Army knew who was drafted and who was a volunteer. And so did anyone who got to see any of your paperwork.
I wonder why make the distinction.
I don't know. I don't know.
Unless there would be problems,
Yeah.
you know, somewhere. It also said in your pre-interview questionnaire that you got sick.
Yeah, I developed an upper respiratory infection, which is not unusual in Louisiana in the middle of winter.
Oh. What was
And
the weather like in Louisiana?
40s and 50s and rainy. So they actually tried things to prevent the spread of upper respiratory disease. We had tent halves we had to put between our bunks to reduce airflow between bunks. When we went out on bivouac, instead of sharing a pup tent, we each had individual pup tents. And those were the things that the doctors told them to do to reduce it, but some of us still got it. So I ended up spending 2 or 3 days, I forget which, in the base hospital, which looks more like a barracks than a hospital. But
And at this time, you're just getting all kinds of basic training.
yeah, training in things like, in addition to marksmanship and that sort of thing that you think is obvious, training in military protocol, training in orienteering, using a map and a compass to find out where you are. All the things they figure a soldier might need to use at some point. Training in first aid. You get the wonderful experience of going into a room filled with tear gas and taking off your gas mask, and then having to recite something to the sergeant before he lets you leave.
And how did that end up?
That was not fun. Everybody got through it, but it made you clearly understand that you never want to be exposed to tear gas again in your life.
Yeah.
You got the thrill of throwing a hand grenade and listening to it blow up and hoping you didn't drop it so the sergeant would have to throw it down the scuttle hole. You got to watch demonstrations of various weapons. At the time, saw the M60 machine gun, the LAW, the light anti-tank weapon. They liked blowing up tanks with that and showing that to the recruits as something. Here's something you can do. Now they'd use a Stinger missile instead, but it was a similar concept. You do a lot of marching, obstacle courses, running around a track, just a whole wide variety of different activities that would be relevant at some point.
And at this point, are they starting to notice that certain people have, this certain skill set? Let's kind of push them?
Not really at that point in basic training. What happened to me was about 1 to 2 weeks, I think it was about 2 weeks before I was due to end basic training. Myself and another guy got called into one of the administrative offices. And a civilian clerk said, okay, Private Falk, you're currently scheduled to go to advanced infantry training. And I said, oh, great. But we'll give you an opportunity based on your test scores to voluntarily instead go to Vietnamese language school. I said, oh, that's thrilling too. The only negative is if you go to Vietnamese language school, because it's a 1-year program, you need to extend your time in service by a year. Didn't sound like a great deal to me. I think the other guy might have opted for it. I didn't. So I was fully expecting to have to go to advanced infantry training.
And what would that entail?
That one, I forget how long it is. It's 8 or 12 weeks or something of more intense training on the various infantry weapons. Actually getting to fire a machine gun and stuff like that. And then you would get assigned after that to an infantry unit somewhere in the world. From people I've talked to, the most likely actually being a unit in Germany at the time.
And was it just that extra time tacked on that made you make the decision not to go into the language?
Well, you add to that the certainty that if you learn Vietnamese, guess where you're going?
Yeah.
Not much choice of going to Germany if you know Vietnamese. So that was another reason to be very hesitant about it. On the other hand, if one believed the war was winding down, then you'd say, okay, well, after a year, maybe it won't still be there and I'll get a pass.
Yeah.
So there was risk either way. But then as it turned out, the day before our graduation ceremony, they passed out the orders, and instead of being ordered to advanced infantry training, my order said, you have I think it was a 2-week leave followed by reporting to Pine Bluff, Arkansas. I said, what's that?
But what was your feeling when you read that? Not knowing where it is, maybe.
Not knowing where it is, I said, well, at least it's in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
It's not advanced infantry training or any kind of training. And I think it also said in the orders that I was going to be, excuse me, be a mathematics statistics assistant, which was the job that that guy I talked about earlier had gotten at Fort Huachuca.
Yeah.
So I said, I must have done really well on that math test. And I did research it later, and what it was the testing, but it was also the fact that I had a math degree and had at least 6 months, barely, of work experience. And the program had an opening. And it was a program at the Pentagon in the Army that, for whatever reason, was able to, if they needed someone, they could pull whomever they wanted coming out of basic training and say, we're overriding your other assignment. We've got you now.
So in some ways, it's going back to that luck of the draw, but in other ways, they had something that very specific that they were looking for.
Fit.
Yeah.
And it worked.
Okay.
So I took the 2 weeks leave, spent it with my wife, who was back at school finishing up her degree. And she drove me to Detroit's airport, and I flew down to Pine Bluff, Arkansas, which at the time you could actually fly to. And I get there, and I say, okay, I'm here in Pine Bluff, Arkansas. Where do I go? So I look in the phone book, and I find Pine Bluff Arsenal Headquarters Company, a phone number. I call them up, tell them I'm here, and they say, okay, we'll send a truck for you.
So
Other than that, I had no idea where I was going.
Oh, wow. I think they would give you a little bit better direction than that.
You'd think.
What kind of area is Pine Bluff then?
It's right on the Arkansas River. The main industry in Pine Bluff is pulp mills.
So it has a nice odor to it.
Yeah, a nice odor to it when the wind's blowing the wrong way. The most famous person I can think of from Pine Bluff was Mitchell, Mrs. Mitchell, the wife of a member of the cabinet, came from there. But other than that, it's just this little town sort of in the middle of nowhere, about an hour's drive south of Little Rock. And they've got the 2 pulp mills, and they've got the arsenal, Pine Bluff Arsenal.
And so they pick you up?
Picked me up, drove me there. I signed in at the headquarters company orderly room. They took me over to the barracks, which was really nice because they actually had rooms in it instead of the long. So there were rooms with 2 people in each room. So modern barracks.
Yeah.
Explained to me that they had no mess hall. And so as a result of that, everyone stationed there, all the enlisted people, got what was called rations not available allowance added to their pay. And you ate your meals at the NCO club, paying for them each time you went there. It was an unusual place, just to describe it a little bit. It's a fairly large piece of land. There are approximately, at the time I was there, 1,000 civilians who worked there and 100 military. Of the 100 military, about 20 or so were officers, and the rest were enlisted. Of the enlisted, about 20 or so were permanently assigned, and the rest were compassionate reassignments. I don't know if you've heard that term before, but they were individuals in the Army who, for some reason, personal reason, needed to be in the area. Like their wife was divorcing them, or their parents had just died, or something like that, so that the Army, the Red Cross told the Army, and the Army said, yes, we'll relocate them to that area temporarily. but it was the only base for many miles around. So if you had a need to be in southern Missouri or any place in Arkansas or eastern Texas part of, or western Tennessee, you'd be there. So we had a fairly large group, but they had no real job to do there. So for a place that only had, remember, about 80 enlisted total, we had a post-movie theater, a post-library, a post-craft shop, a post-bowling alley, all run by these compassionate reassignments. So the first thing that happened when I got there, the next morning I went back to the company. Monday morning I went to the company's orderly room, and they had roll call and everything, and then they went in with the first sergeant, and he said, okay, here's where you're assigned. And at that time I was being assigned to what was called the Directorate of Biological Operations. And had to use the post taxi to get up there because I didn't have a car, and then I really couldn't do anything yet because I couldn't go inside other than with the officer in charge until they had processed my clearance, because it was a secure area. So for the first week or so, I really didn't do very much. And then the clearance came through and I was able to get into the biological operations area.
And so explain what that is and what all you had to do.
DBO was one of the locations in the U.S. where the U.S. Army created biological weapons. At the time I was there, however, they were in the process of destroying biological weapons. And they had munitions that had various biological agents in them that they were processing chemically and through heat and other means to try to kill the agents, kill the bacteria and viruses. And after they do that, they'd have to have some way of verifying that they had actually killed the stuff. So in a sort of a unique situation, we had a post-veterinarian, a lieutenant, with a number of animals, different kinds, guinea pigs, monkeys, that were used to test these supposedly destroyed munitions. So they'd be two groups, a control group and the test group. And what I would have to do is run statistical analyses on the mortality rates of the two groups to make sure that the test group didn't have a significantly higher mortality rate than the control group, to verify that this stuff had been killed. Now, that wasn't supposed to be my original assignment there, but that's where I was placed because the person who was supposed to have been in there got injured at basic training and was being delayed a few weeks, and so I took his job for a while.
And what did you think of that job?
I thought it was great they were destroying the stuff.
Yeah.
It was actually fun working with the post-veterinarian. He was a really nice guy, a drafted officer. And I had a fair amount of free time up there. So it really was easier than the job I had been doing before I got drafted, and allowed me actually some time to study actuarial exams or to start studying again. That lasted, as I say, about a month or so, maybe 6 weeks, until Alan Tweedy arrived at the post, and then he took over that job and I switched to the job I was supposed to have had, which was in the Arsenal's Quality Control Laboratory.
And what did that entail?
Well, the main reason for the Arsenal's existence at the time I was there was to manufacture smoke bombs and white phosphorus bombs for use in Vietnam. The colored smoke bombs that you see in movies and things that they drop or that the soldiers ignite so that helicopters knew where to come. And so they had the laboratory that tested the smoke mixture, the chemical mixture, to make sure that it was within specifications. And there were actually two permanently assigned enlisted people who worked there alongside the civilians in doing the testing. And then I was the statistician who took the results of their tests and made sure that they were statistically valid, which meant once a day I'd have to enter the data, have the computer up at the headquarters turned on, run the program, and then report the results, which once again left me a lot of spare time the rest of the day. And I worked directly for a civilian. My supervisor was a civilian.
What was the interaction like between military personnel and the civilians that you worked with?
We got along great.
Okay.
I mean, they viewed us as, part of their team, part of the labor they needed to get their jobs done. Help them get their jobs done and get the Army to approve everything so that they'd keep getting pay increases and things like that. And they really, other than the fact that we had to go off and do some military things, that we were in uniform all the time, and that if we wanted a 3-day pass, we had to get our civilian supervisor to sign off on it before the company commander would. They treated us just like employees.
And did your family come and join you at this?
After a while, that summer, Lydia and Eric came down and joined me, and we had found an apartment off post that we stayed in very inexpensively down there. And so they spent the summer with me, and then they came back so that Lydia could finish up the last part of her schooling before they came down again.
And so before that, you said that the barracks there had 2 to a room?
Yeah.
Did you have to share a room then with?
Yeah.
And was it somebody doing similar kinds of things as you? So.
No, I think it was 2 or 3 different compassionate reassignments, so they kept changing. Just the way it worked out. I think each of us who was permanently assigned had a room, and then when they needed the other bed for someone, they put someone in there.
Okay. And were there any issues with the compassionate assigned? I mean, they're there under kind of duress.
Yeah,
stressful situations.
Actually, they were happy to be there in the sense that they weren't where they had been before, and they were there where they could deal with their problems. I don't recall any of them ever being an issue. I think they all were happy doing the little jobs they were doing around the arsenal that really weren't that much work for them. I mean, you're running a craft shop, or running a library, or it ended up some of them who were there long enough ended up developing interesting tactics for dealing with the situation. We had this one guy who ran the Post Theater. The theater was handled through the USO, through the Post Exchange. And he read up the rules for the Post Exchange theaters. And one of the rules said that if attendance fell below a certain level, from then on, movies would be free. Otherwise, they were a tremendous 50 cents. So he deliberately ordered 2 bad movies and told us all, I'm going to order these crappy movies, don't show up. So for 2 weeks, nobody showed up, or maybe one person showed up. He filled in the paperwork. They say, okay, from now on, the movies are free. So we got free movies. Several of us who were there longer got jobs on the Post. For example, I initially started a job working at the Post Exchange for 2 hours a day for extra money and something to do. And then when an opening came up, I ended up being a bartender in the NCO club. Another friend of mine, Dave Livingston, was a bartender in the Officers Club. So we all found things to do that filled more of our time and gave us a little extra money.
Were there guys coming from surrounding areas to these kinds of amenities? I mean, you talk about attendance for the movies needs to be above a certain, but you've only got
Well, the number was like if more than 10 people show up, then you have to pay for it or something like that. It was a fairly low hurdle.
Yeah, and you're a bartender at a officers club, but there's only so many officers.
Like 20 or 30 officers, and he actually got pretty good tips there.
Yeah,
because they were there every night. Some of them. And there were a couple of, and the civilians could come into the NCO club, and some of the civilians could go into the officers club. So there was one civilian who would stop in the NCO club every night on the way home and have 2 shots of vodka.
And what about the movie theater and bowling alley? Then?
Now,
Were
they tended to just be the assigned military who went to them.
Were there any incidents while you were working at the arsenal?
Like about 3 or 4 months before I was discharged, about 4 months before, I ended up getting on the post chemical biological radiological team, CBR team. And we had to have a CBR team. Of course, every Army unit has one, but in particular we did because in addition to the director of biological operations and the smoke bomb manufacturing area, it was also a storage depot. And they had bunkers with lots and lots of chemical weapons in them. So, and they also had a section where mustard gas had been prepared during World War II that was off limits because they had tried destroying the buildings and the workers couldn't be there. After, you know, a very short time on the job, you got blisters all over your skin because the wood was just soaked with the stuff. So that was just off limits. But anyway, there was one time while I was on the CBR team where lightning hit one of the igloos, one of the bunkers where they had, in this case, we were fortunate it was BZ. BZ is an hallucinogenic agent. It was the agent the Army developed after they determined LSD wasn't reliable enough. And so this was stored in there, and a civilian guard was actually exposed to it as a result of the fire. So the CBR team had to set up a perimeter around it and maintain security around it and check to make sure that none of it leaked while a civilian contractor came in and cleaned it up.
What kind of other safety precautions then? I mean, you had a lot of very powerful chemicals and agents there. Did you wear protective suits?
Well, when we were on the CBR team duty, if we were in an area where, well, if we were close to the mustard gas or if we were doing a drill to practice what would happen, there were a couple of times during the summer when the temperature would be 98 degrees and we'd be wearing full butyl rubber suits. Which basically means you have to strip after 15 minutes and get cooled off.
Yeah.
Because your body does not breathe while you're wearing that. So we practiced those things, but I was never in an environment where we had to wear those as a regular part of the job.
And was there, I would imagine, very good security around?
Yeah, well, there are obviously the typical fences with barbed wire and everything all the way around. Security for the base was handled by civilians. And there was a very large civilian security force that were always in trucks and things driving around the base, but also anytime you went into the base, you had to go past the guard post. They checked your trunk, they checked under the car, and then let you in, even if you had a military ID and a pass to get in there. And they also checked on the way out to make sure you weren't taking anything out. And you couldn't get in without some sort of a pass, either a guest pass issued by the headquarters or your ID that allowed you to be on the base.
So were you able to come back to this area at all during leave time? Did you get some of those kinds of passes?
Yeah, I mean, about every 2 months I'd talk my supervisor into a 3-day pass and fly home. And after Lydia came down, I'd take a week's leave and we'd go someplace. I mean, I came home for Christmas. Well, all of us came home for Christmas, things like that. So yeah, I mean, they were actually pretty good about making sure we got our 30 days leave a year that we were entitled to. And it was a situation where it was probably easier to schedule that than in most situations.
Did you stay in contact with any of the people that you went through basic with?
No, none of the people from basic, because we got all spread all over, and especially in my situation where I went to this very small base, and that was the only place I ever went after basic training. For a few years, we did keep in contact with a couple of the people I met there, but then that faded away as we sort of drifted apart.
So you're still in military service, 72. Vietnam is then starting to wind down,
Right.
or
Right. They're actually in 1972 they started the first reduction in force, or RIF. And I was getting the promotions on the regular schedule, and in fact in I don't remember which month in 1972, as it probably says on my DD 214, but July 1972. In May 1972, they had a promotions board because you needed to go through a promotions board to become an E5, which is a sergeant, or in terms of what I was doing at that time, it was called a Specialist 5 because I was non-combat. And so I went to the promotions board and there were 5 of us who went before the promotions board at the Arsenal. All 5 of us ended up getting promoted because we got promotions board scores that were way above the cutoff. You know, there were 2 engineers, 2 mathematicians. So that was no big deal. So we all got promoted then. And shortly after that, we heard about the Army deciding they were going to have to reduce their force. And there was a program that said if you had a civilian job waiting and could get a notarized statement from your employer, you could get out up to 3 months early. So I immediately wrote a letter to my employer. Said, if you sign this and send it to me, I'll be out 3 months early. And they said, great. So they did that. So I was actually only in 1 year, 9 months, and 1 day.
Okay. CNA, right?
Yeah.
So they were holding your job basically for you, or?
Well, they had to hold it by law.
They did.
Yes, there is a law that says if you're drafted, just like with the National Guard now, if you're called up,
Yeah.
they have to hold your job for you. They have to give you your job back when you get out.
Okay.
And they were eager to do it anyway.
Yeah.
But the law said they had to, barring the company going bankrupt or some similar circumstance. So I got the letter from them, brought it to the adjutant's office at the headquarters of the Arsenal, and said, okay, I'd like to apply for this program. They said, fine. They put in all the paperwork, and it came back that I would be separated under that program. One other sort of interesting anecdote, or something might be interesting about the Arsenal, as with any military installation, from time to time, you have to have all of the troops assembled for announcements and celebrations, whatever. Remember, this is Pine Bluff, in the middle of the summer. We're having these monthly gatherings of all the troops standing at attention. We had a few people who had to have their rifles with so they could fire salutes. Everybody else was standing at attention in their full uniforms. Somehow, and I'm not sure how I actually swung this, I convinced the company commander that what they really needed was someone sitting in an air-conditioned squad car reading the announcements. So every time we had one of these formations, I got to sit in the air-conditioned squad car with the bullhorn reading the announcements.
And how did that go over with your...
Well, given the tenor of most of us who were there, because most of us were draftees, everybody thought it was a hoot.
Yeah.
We had this thing called the short medal. When you were the individual who had the fewest days left in his service commitment, you got to be the one to wear the short medal and to substitute the name Short for your own name. Company commander wasn't that thrilled with it, but he let it go anyway because it actually helped morale. As it turned out, I got to wear that for almost 6 months. So that was sort of the tone of a number of us there. It was not as serious as you might have thought. And unless he had a bad day, the company commander went along with it because it helped morale.
How was morale there? I would picture it being okay.
It really was, because it was really an easy duty. And most of us, you know, we got to do it. It's better than a lot of jobs we could have gotten in the military. And the main thing is make the most of it. I mean, I probably was able to make more of it than anyone else because with my chosen profession, I studied for and passed 3 actuarial exams while I was down there,
Yeah.
which furthered my profession while I was doing my duty to the country. So in that I was very fortunate, and that's probably quite unusual. The engineers viewed it, the electrical engineers and chemical engineers viewed it as, well, they're getting practical experience. And that will help them when they get back out into the job market.
Was there ever any moral questioning, moral debate amongst some of the people working with these chemicals of this is a...
Well, I think most of us were, those of us who knew what was going on, which wasn't everybody because it was still classified to some extent, aware of what was going on at the Director of Biological Operations were in supportive of getting rid of all that stuff. Mm-hmm. The smoke bombs, I don't think anybody had any problems with. You know, okay, smoke bombs in and of themselves are not harmful, and they do help save lives by using the colored smoke to signal back and forth. The part at the main part of the arsenal that maybe was the most troublesome to people is that we also made they made white phosphorus grenades.
Yeah.
And those are horrible things. But they didn't make very many, and not all the time, so nothing we could do about it. But that was the part that we thought was the worst about that particular location. We wish they would have, we talked but not very much about all the nerve agents who were there, and there was really nothing we could do about that except hope that they'd never be used.
Yeah.
There was another shock, I guess I'll call it, when I got there. In basic training, we used M16 rifles all the time. That's what we were trained to use. Mm-hmm. And that's what they used in Vietnam. They're nice and light, they're easy to fire, hardly any kick on your shoulder. I got there, and the first thing I found out is the only weapons they have there are M14s. And I would be expected to qualify on an M14.
Okay.
So those of us who were new, the sergeant had to come in and say, here's an M14, here's how you take it apart, put it back together, just like back in boot camp. And the only rifle range they had was up at the National Guard base north of Little Rock. So twice a year, we all had to trek up there and requalify on M14s.
And just for those listening, what is the difference between an M16 and an M14?
An M16 shoots a .22 caliber bullet, basically. Yeah. Lightweight, high-speed bullet. You carry the rifle around with a handle. I mean, it's really light. And as I said, has very little kick into your shoulder. An M14 is like, I don't know exactly what caliber the slug is, but it's more like a .30-06 deer hunting rifle. I mean, that thing weighs 20 pounds, it seems. I mean, it's just really heavy, has a lot of kick. And if you're used to shooting this lightweight thing, you have no idea how to hit any target with that heavy thing. And so it really took a while to qualify the first time, but you have to do it every 6 months. You have to requalify.
When you finish up with your service, you come back to this general area up north,
yes,
as it were.
Yes.
What was your feeling, having been a draftee, having served, with the way that the community was sort of responding to those coming back from Vietnam proper?
I was really appalled with all the things they were doing to the Vietnam returnees. Yeah. I just thought it was terrible. I had met several people when I was in Pine Bluff who had been in Vietnam, who came back from there. And, you know, the things they had to go through and then the way the people treated them was just sad.
Yeah. Thankfully, I think we learned a little bit of lesson from that and have done better with our troops now. But yeah, that's always incredibly shocking when I talk to somebody that served in Vietnam. It's hard to believe.
Yeah.
You didn't have any...
I didn't experience any of that. I was in a different situation, not having gone there. I never even experienced any negative attitudes when I had to travel in uniform, which you had to do military standby. Yeah. in those days, which is the only way you could afford to fly as an enlisted man. And it was really cheap, so he did it. But I really, all the news stories you read and all the stories you heard about how people who had been in Vietnam and how they were treated when they came back, just very upsetting.
What was the mood of your family then as you come back?
Relief.
Yeah. And that was probably the case too when they found out you were going to Arkansas.
To Arkansas instead of, I mean, my parents came down and visited us in Arkansas while we were down there, and I think my sister came once as well, so it was much nicer being there than out of the country at that time.
Now, could you show them anything at the arsenal, or was that kind of off limits to?
A little bit. I mean, I did actually bring my dad onto the arsenal to go fishing.
Oh.
So they had ponds on the arsenal with canoes and boats where you could go fishing, as long as you avoided the water moccasins. They could come on, and there were a lot of it they could see. I just couldn't take them into the, obviously, the biological operations area or even into the quality control lab I worked at, because that was in an area that was considered more secure, although there was no guard on it.
Yeah.
Most of the arsenal, once you could get someone on, was fairly open. Not that there was that much to see, but.
How was the fishing there?
The largemouth bass fishing was pretty good.
Yeah. Was there anything else that you got to experience while you were living in the South that surprised you, maybe, having grown up in the Chicago area?
At least at that time in Pine Bluff, the war between the states seemed sometimes to still be on. I mean, they really had a different attitude about that than we do. Lydia came down and joined me and actually spent one semester teaching at one of the local high schools, Whitehall High School. And the attitudes at that time about racial distinctions, I mean, as a white woman, she was basically told, you will never touch a black male student. You just can't. I mean, she had been taught as a teacher that sometimes a good way to help a student is, put a hand on the shoulder and say, now, Johnny, can't do that. So there were those little, they weren't as obvious things, but there were those little things. Learn to like catfish. Had a little place in town called Catfish Cove. The Arkansas was early on in the trend toward help yourself gas stations. And they had a chain of gas stations called Help Yourself.
You didn't come back with an accent, did you?
No, no.
Was there, once you were finished, once you had your paperwork, was there anything else? Did you just sort of wave goodbye and ride into the sunset, or did Uncle Sam kind of keep contact with you, I guess is?
Well, theoretically, I could have been called up to go to annual training. I never was. So you're always sort of in the back of your mind wondering. And then there was a point in time when I got the final notice saying, you are hereby discharged from the active reserve, or the ready reserve, or whatever they called it. I said, okay, then that's all done. There's no threat of that anymore. And that was the only contact.
And how long was that after?
It's several years. I don't remember, it's several years, 5 or 10 years, something like that. And at that point, then you're no longer susceptible to being called back to active duty.
Okay. And so you went back to work at CNA?
I went back to work right away at CNA, and because I had passed 3 exams while I was in the Army, I got a big promotion and started out my career again.
Were the 2 gentlemen that had also served that you mentioned previously, were they still there?
Oh, yes, they were still there.
And then I guess, did any of this experience shape decisions that you made in the future, whether it was for you or for your family?
I'm sure they did. Certainly it got me more used to the Army's hurry up and wait philosophy, and so I became a bit more patient at waiting for things, so even though I still hate it. Having lived in the South for that period of time, I guess we understood a little more about their differences of opinion. Not that we agree that they're right, but that at least, and we actually, when Clinton was running for president, appreciated what went on in Arkansas. And the whole scandal thing that was going on there with the real estate and Hillary and her law practice. I mean, that's Arkansas. So that wasn't a surprise to us.
You have a son?
We have 2 sons and a daughter.
2 sons and a daughter. Wow. Have they ever expressed interest in joining the military? Would
No.
you ever?
No, they have not expressed interest, and we did not encourage it or anything. Although our younger son, one of his best friends, is now a captain, hopefully soon to be major in the Army.
Okay. Well, I think that's all I have. Was there anything that we didn't discuss today that you thought we might?
No, I think you've been very comprehensive in your questions. It was an experience, one in many respects I wish I hadn't had to go through, and I wish a lot of other people had not had to go through, especially those who ended up in combat. But it's what we need to do to support our country.
Okay. Well, I appreciate your time today, and that concludes this oral history interview. Thank you.
Hey, thank you.